December 4th, 1939. Just after 11 in the morning, a cold, flat light lies over the sea at the northern entrance to Loch Ewe on the northwest coast of Scotland. Riding at the head of the home fleet is the battleship Nelson, 27,000 tons of armour and gun steel, the flagship of Admiral Sir Charles Forbes, the most important warship in British home waters. She is doing something a battleship does 1,000 times without a second thought. She is coming home. She is moving slowly through a stretch of water her own navy considers safe. There are no enemy ships in sight. There are no enemy aircraft overhead. The sea is empty. And then the sea lifts her. A column of water climbs up the port side. A shock runs through the hull, and men are thrown off their feet 3 decks down. The flagship of the home fleet has been mined, holed, and flooded, in her own protected anchorage, by a weapon that touched nothing above the surface. No submarine periscope, no falling bomb, no floating iron sphere bumping against the plating, nothing that the lookouts, straining at their binoculars, had been trained for 2 decades to see. Down in the wreckage of the forward compartments, damage control parties are already fighting the water. Above them, on the bridge, a very simple question is forming in the mind of every officer who understands what has just happened. It is the same question that had been forming, ship by ship, harbour by harbour, all along the east coast of Britain for the previous 3 months. It is a question that will eventually climb all the way up to Winston Churchill himself, and it goes like this. If the enemy is not here, if there is no ship and no aircraft and no visible weapon, then what, exactly, is sinking us? And how do we fight something we cannot see, cannot sweep, and cannot even find? Hold on to that question, because this is not really a story about a mine. This is a story about the difference between a weapon and a secret. It is a story about how the most experienced navy in the world could be brought to the edge of strangulation by a device the size of a household boiler. And it is a story about how the whole terrifying advantage of that device rested on one single condition. The enemy must never, ever be allowed to hold one in his hands and take it apart. This is the story of the magnetic mine and of the men who took that condition away. To understand why a German naval officer in the winter of 1939 could be so confident, you have to understand what everyone, on both sides, believed a sea mine was. For the whole of the previous World War, and for the 20 years after it, a mine meant one basic thing. It meant a contact mine. Picture the object almost everyone can picture. A black iron sphere, roughly the size of a large beach ball, studded with little horns. It floats a few feet under the surface, held down by a cable anchored to a weight on the seabed. The horns are soft lead. Inside each one is a small glass tube of acid. When a ship's hull strikes a horn, the lead crumples, the glass breaks, the acid runs down into a battery cell. The cell delivers a current, and the current fires the charge. Simple, reliable, and, crucially, defeatable. Because a contact mine has a fatal weakness. It has to be touched, and a weapon that has to be touched can be cut loose. The whole art of minesweeping in 1939 was built around that fact. A pair of small ships, usually converted trawlers manned by fishermen who had swapped their nets for the Navy's blue, would steam side by side towing a serrated wire between them, held down and spread apart by devices called otters and kites. The wire would catch the mine's mooring cable, drag it into a cutter, and snip it. The mine would bob to the surface, and a gunner would sink it with rifle fire. It was dangerous, cold, monotonous work, but it was understood work. The threat had a shape. The threat had a location. The threat floated at a known depth on a known cable, and everything about British mine defence assumed that this was what a mine was, and always would be. There is something worth understanding about the men who did this sweeping, because they are easy to overlook. Most of them were not regular sailors at all. They were trawlermen from Grimsby and Lowestoft and Aberdeen, men who had spent their lives dragging nets across the same North Sea that was now full of mines, and who had been swept up into a branch of the Royal Navy that the rest of the fleet cheerfully looked down on. They handled their little ships with a rough, unhurried competence, and they had a strong stomach for tedious danger. But their whole trade rested on the one assumption that the German magnetic mine was about to demolish. They knew how to cut a cable. They had no idea what to do about a weapon that had no cable to cut, that lay on the bottom out of reach of any wire, and that could count a sweeper as just another ship worth destroying. The sweep that had kept the coasts open through the whole of the previous war was, against this new thing, a length of wire dragged uselessly through empty water above a mine that simply waited for something bigger to come along. The German magnetic mine broke every single one of those assumptions at once. It did not float. It lay flat on the bottom, in the shallow water of estuaries and harbour approaches and coastal channels, in the exact places where the sea narrows and every ship entering or leaving Britain is forced to pass. It had no mooring cable, so there was nothing for a sweep wire to catch. It had no horns, because it did not need to be touched, and it did not wait to be struck. It waited to be sensed. Here is the idea at the heart of it, and it is worth slowing down for, because the elegance of it is exactly what made it so dangerous. Every large steel ship is, without anyone intending it, a magnet. During the months a hull is under construction, sitting still in one orientation, while thousands of rivets are hammered and steel plates are worked, all that iron slowly takes on a permanent magnetism of its own in the Earth's field. On top of that, a moving steel hull bends and concentrates the Earth's own vertical magnetic field around itself. The result is that a ship carries with it, everywhere it goes, an invisible magnetic signature, a distortion in the field of the planet, shaped like the ship, dragging along beneath the waterline. You cannot see it, the crew cannot feel it, but a sufficiently delicate instrument, sitting quietly on the seabed, can. And that is precisely what the Germans put inside the mine. At the core of the firing mechanism was a finely balanced magnetic needle, a dip needle, held level by a spring, poised on the very edge of movement. As a ship passed overhead, the change in the vertical magnetic field tilted that needle. The needle closed an electrical contact. The contact fired the charge. No touch, no cable, no warning, just a ship going about its business, carrying its own invisible executioner in the iron of its hull. And the charge did not have to punch a neat hole in the side, the way a contact mine did. Because the mine lay on the bottom, sometimes directly beneath the keel, the explosion sent an enormous pressure wave straight up into the most vulnerable part of any ship, the flat underside that no armour ever protects. A big ground mine could lift a vessel bodily in the water, snap her spine, throw her engines off their mountings, and break her in two. It did not damage ships, it destroyed them. There was a further cruelty built into the physics of it. The mine did not care how thick your armour was, because it never touched the armour. A battleship was designed around the idea of taking a shell or a torpedo on its heavily protected side and shrugging it off. None of that protection reached under the keel, where the water was supposed to be your friend. So the magnetic mine turned the strongest warship and the humblest coaster into roughly equal targets. The great belt of steel that made a battleship was, against a weapon that struck from directly below, so much dead weight. That is why the mining of a cruiser like Belfast or a battleship like Nelson was so profoundly disturbing to the men who understood it. These were not ships that were supposed to be vulnerable. They were the most protected objects the country could build, and they were being broken by a cylinder lying quietly in the mud that had never so much as scratched their paint. The Germans had two main airborne versions. The lighter one carried a charge of around 500 kilograms. The heavier one, the one the British would come to fear most, carried roughly 1,000 kilograms, more than a ton of high explosive, in a cylinder about 2 feet across and over 8 feet long. When dropped from an aircraft, it came down under a parachute of green artificial silk, roughly 27 feet across, drifting toward the water at around 40 miles per hour, so that it would not shatter on impact. A soluble plug and a pressure-sensitive mechanism kept it inert until it had sunk below a certain depth, and only then did it arm itself and settle down to wait. Now put yourself inside the German Naval Command in the autumn of 1939, and you can understand the confidence. They had a weapon that could not be seen from the surface. It could not be caught by any sweep wire in the British inventory, because there was no cable to catch. It sat in exactly the shallow choke points that an island nation could not avoid using, and it attacked the one part of a ship that could never be armoured. Against the entire, proud, 20-year-old edifice of British minesweeping, it was, very nearly, the perfect weapon. There was only one thread from which the whole thing hung. The British did not know how it worked, and as long as they did not know how it worked, they could not begin to defeat it. The mines started killing almost at once. On September 10th, 1939, only a week into the war, the first ships went down to German mines off the east coast. Through September and October, the toll climbed steadily, and the men in the Admiralty began to notice a pattern that frightened them. Ships were being lost in swept channels. Water that had been checked and declared clear was killing ships anyway. Vessels were breaking their backs in places where, by every rule the Navy understood, no mine could be. The Royal Navy did what the Royal Navy always did. It went looking for the mines. Through October and November, mine recovery teams examined more than 200 mines pulled from British waters. And here is the maddening part. Every single one of them was a contact mine. Ordinary, moored, horned, understood. Not one of them explained the ships that were dying in clear water. The weapon that was doing the real damage was leaving no evidence because it detonated itself completely on the seabed and left nothing behind but a broken ship and a rising question. The numbers tell the story better than any adjective. In November 1939 alone, mines sank 27 merchant ships, adding up to around 121,000 tons of shipping. Across October and November together, Britain lost more than 200,000 tons to mines. For a country that imported almost everything, food, fuel, the raw materials of war, across the sea, those figures were not a statistic. They were a slow closing of the throat. Every mined channel was a channel shut until it could be cleared. Every shut channel pushed more traffic into fewer routes, and those routes into greater danger. And it was not only merchant ships. On November 13th, 1939, the cruiser Adventure was mined near the approaches to Harwich. The destroyer Blanche, going to her aid, was mined as well, and sank, the first British destroyer lost to a mine in the war. On November 21st, in one single day near Harwich and the Thames, the destroyer Gipsy was mined, and the Japanese liner Terukuni Maru, nearly 12,000 tons, was lost. That same day, far to the north off the Firth of Forth, the new cruiser Belfast, one of the most modern warships in the fleet, ran onto a magnetic mine. The explosion broke her keel, wrecked a boiler and engine room, and threw men against the deckhead above them. Dozens were injured. One man, a young painter thrown by the blast and struck on the head, would later die. Belfast, barely months into her career, was so badly hurt that she would spend the next 3 years under repair and would not return to service until near the end of 1942. Then, 2 weeks after that, came the mining of the battleship Nelson at Loch Ewe, where this story began. The First Lord of the Admiralty, the civilian minister in charge of the whole Royal Navy, was Winston Churchill. He had returned to that office the day the war began, and the mine crisis landed squarely on his desk. He would admit later, with unusual frankness, that the terrible damage a large ground mine could do had simply not been fully understood before the war. He visited the Navy's mine and torpedo school, a shore establishment near Portsmouth that carried the ship's name Vernon, in the very first weeks of the war, and made it clear that solving this was a first-order national problem, because everyone at the top now understood the arithmetic. Britain could not outbuild these losses. If the magnetic mine could not be answered, and answered soon, the sea lanes on which the entire country depended would close one at a time. Churchill treated the thing with the urgency it deserved. He was a man who reached instinctively for the technical detail, who wanted to know exactly how a weapon worked and exactly what could be done to it, and he pressed the scientists and the naval officers hard for answers. In public, he was careful never to sound beaten. He would later tell the country, in that steady, combative voice, that the magnetic mine and the other new weapons did not present the nation with any problem it regarded as insoluble. But privately, in those weeks, the pressure was intense, because the losses were real and the answer did not yet exist. What the Navy needed, above everything, was to get its hands on one of these mines whole and undamaged, so that the scientists could do the rest. And that was the one thing it had so far completely failed to do. But you cannot build a defense against a weapon you do not understand, and every mine that might have been examined had blown itself to nothing. What the Royal Navy needed, more than ships, more than sweepers, more than anything, was one intact German magnetic mine. One complete, unexploded, undamaged specimen that its scientists could open up and read like a book. The entire crisis, all those lost ships, all those closed channels, all that mounting fear, came down to a single desperate need: get one whole. And through October and November, that is precisely the thing they could not do. The mines were doing their work perfectly. They fell in deep water, or they went off, or they buried themselves in mud where no one could reach them. The secret stayed a secret, and the ships kept dying. The break, when it finally came from the enemy's own mistake. It came, as these things often do, from a rivalry inside the German war machine. The German Navy had wanted to lay these mines by ship and by submarine, quietly, precisely, in deep and useful water. But the aircraft that could scatter mines far more quickly belonged not to the Navy, but to the Air Force, Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe, and the two services competed for the glory and the resources as fiercely as they fought the British. When the Air Force began dropping mines by parachute into the Thames estuary, they were operating a naval weapon in a way the Navy had not fully controlled, and on the night of November 22nd, 1939, that loosened grip produced exactly the gift the Royal Navy had been praying for. An anti-aircraft battery on the Thames watched a low-flying German aircraft come in over the estuary and release objects that drifted down under parachutes. This in itself was a clue, because a parachute meant the weapon was meant for water and needed to be lowered gently. But the crucial thing was where they fell. Two of the mines came down not in the deep channel but on the tidal mudflats off Shoeburyness, at the mouth of the Thames, on ground that belonged to the army, ground that the sea covers at high water and uncovers at low. For a few hours, twice a day, one of the most secret weapons of the war was going to be lying in the open air, on British soil, waiting. Word reached the mine school at Portsmouth, and two officers were sent for at once. The senior of the two was Lieutenant Commander John Ouvry. The second was Lieutenant Commander Roger Lewis. Both were rendering mines safe officers, men whose peacetime specialism had suddenly become the most valuable and most dangerous trade in the Navy. They gathered what men and equipment they could and went to Shoeburyness through the night, knowing that they had until the tide turned, and no longer. When they reached the mudflats, they found the mine staked down against the returning water so it would not be moved or lost, and by the light of hand torches they began the first, careful examination. Ouvry and Lewis studied the cylinder in the darkness and identified two fittings near one end that mattered. One looked like a hydrostatic valve, the kind of pressure device they half expected. The other was a polished fitting of light metal, held in place by a screwed ring and sealed with black wax, and neither man had ever seen anything quite like it. It was clearly important. It was almost certainly connected to the firing mechanism, and it was almost certainly the most likely thing to kill them. Everything about the setting worked against them. It was late November, at the mouth of the Thames, in the dark, on ground that was neither land nor sea but cold, tidal mud that pulled at the boots and would soon be under water again. They had a matter of hours before the tide came back and swallowed the mine, and possibly their only chance with it. They had no proper diagram of what they were dealing with, because no British hand had ever taken one of these apart. Every fitting on the casing was a question, and at least one of those questions, they had to assume, was designed to answer itself with more than a ton of high explosive. And they could not simply attack it, because the wrong tool, the wrong movement, the wrong scrap of steel in a pocket might be the thing that set it off. They made a decision that tells you everything about how this kind of work was done. They would not rush it in the dark. Lewis carefully took an impression of the sealed ring, pressing a signal pad against it to capture its exact size and shape, so that back at Portsmouth a spanner could be made to fit it. And not just any spanner. It had to be made of brass, because the one thing they could not risk, working on a weapon that was triggered by magnetism, was to bring a piece of ordinary magnetic steel anywhere near it. An ordinary wrench, an ordinary screwdriver, the ordinary iron tools of any workshop in the world might themselves be enough to tilt that delicate needle inside and fire the charge. So the tools had to be non-magnetic, brass and other metals that carry no magnetic signature of their own. They would take the weapon apart, in effect, with a set of instruments specially made to be invisible to it. The next day, November 23rd, at low water, they went back out onto the mud to do the thing itself. And here Ouvry made the choice that defines him. He would work on the mine with just one other man beside him, Chief Petty Officer Charles Baldwin. The other two, Lewis and an able seaman named Verncombe, he stationed some distance away, watching, deliberately kept back. His reasoning was cold and clear and humane all at once. If he and Baldwin made a mistake, if the mine went off, then Lewis and Verncombe would survive, would have watched exactly what was done and what went wrong, and could carry that knowledge back so that the next team would not repeat it. He was building redundancy into the operation with human lives. He was making sure that even a failure would teach something. Every man emptied his pockets of anything metal. Then Ouvry and Baldwin approached the mine. Ouvry took the brass tools to that polished, wax-sealed fitting first, the one that worried him most. He worked the keep ring loose. It came free more easily than he had feared. He lifted the fitting out, and beneath it lay a detonator. He and Baldwin gently removed it. So far the mine had not objected. But there were more fittings, some of them on the underside, buried in the sand where the mine had settled. Now Ouvry called the others in. There was no point keeping them at a distance any longer, because the remaining work needed hands, and the most dangerous single step was behind him. Together the men eased the mine over to reach the fittings underneath, and there they found and removed a second detonator, one that resembled the firing arrangement of the ordinary German horned mine they already knew. And with that, it was done. The mine was safe. Ouvry wrote afterward, with the flat understatement of his kind, that they felt on top of the world. They did not know how close it had been. The mine had been fitted with an arrangement designed to detonate it, if anyone tampered with it. A booby trap meant precisely to kill men like Ouvry and to keep the secret safe. It had not gone off for one simple reason. The German air crew, dropping their load while under anti-aircraft fire and trying to get away, had failed to complete the step that would have armed it. The enemy's haste, born of that same rushed, contested Air Force run operation, had handed the Royal Navy not just a mine, but a live and whole one that should by rights have blown its discoverers to pieces. By late afternoon, the safe mine was lifted onto a lorry and sent to Portsmouth, to the mine school, where the real reading of the book could begin. There, a physicist named Dr. Albert Wood, the senior scientist of the mine design department, took the firing unit apart piece by piece with his assistants, and now, at last, the secret gave itself up. Inside was the induction mechanism, the balanced magnetic needle, the arrangement that sensed a passing ship's field and closed the circuit. The British could now see, in their own hands, on a laboratory bench, exactly what threshold of magnetism fired the weapon, and in which direction it was most sensitive. The invisible thing had become a diagram, and once a thing is a diagram, engineers can go to work on it. It is difficult, from this distance in time, to feel how much rode on that single afternoon. The men in the Admiralty had spent months staring at losses they could not explain and could not prevent, unable even to hold the thing that was killing them. Now, because of a few hours on a mudflat and a set of brass tools, they knew. They knew the polarity the mine looked for. They knew how strong a field it took to fire it. They knew that the whole terrible business came down to a needle balanced on a spring, and that a needle balanced on a spring can be fooled. Everything that came afterward, every ship saved, every channel reopened, every convoy that reached port because it slid unnoticed over a field of these mines, traces straight back to the moment Ouvry lifted that wax-sealed fitting clear and found the mine had not objected. The recovery at Shoeburyness became one of the first great intelligence victories of the war, and the country was allowed to know it. The following month, on December 19, 1939, King George VI came to the mine school in person and, on the parade ground, presented the first Royal Navy decorations of the war. Ouvry and Lewis received the Distinguished Service Order. A third officer, Lieutenant Glennie, who had helped make the second mine safe, received the Distinguished Service Cross. And Chief Petty Officer Baldwin and able seaman Verncombe, the ratings who had knelt in the cold mud beside the mine, received the Distinguished Service Medal. The mine that Ouvry disarmed survives to this day. It sits aboard the cruiser Belfast, herself a survivor of these same weapons, moored on the Thames in London, where anyone can go and stand in front of the object that once held a nation by the throat. Men like these deserve to be remembered by name, and the whole point of telling the story is that the names do not vanish. If a single detail of this has held your attention, a like on this video is a small thing that keeps their story in front of a few more people, and it costs you nothing at all. Now the story widens, because the men on the mudflat had done only the first half of the job. They had captured the secret. Someone still had to turn that captured secret into a shield that could cover thousands of ships. And this is where the real character of the British effort shows itself, and where the deeper reason for what happened next comes into view. Consider who solved the next part of the problem. The German mine was the product of a large, hierarchical, professional weapons establishment, exactly what you would expect from a modern industrial state at war. The answer to it, on the British side, came substantially from men who were not, in the ordinary sense, naval officers at all. They were reservists and civilians in uniform, scientists, improvisers, the kind of clever, unorthodox, slightly awkward figure that the wartime services nicknamed the boffin, and that the Royal Navy quietly filled its laboratories and workshops with. The single most important figure in defeating the magnetic mine was not an admiral. He was a Canadian chemist. His name was Charles Goodeve. He had been born in the town of Neepawa, in Manitoba, in the middle of the Canadian prairie, in 1904. He studied chemistry at the University of Manitoba, then came to London and became a reader in physical chemistry at University College London, a serious academic scientist by profession. But he had also served in the Canadian Naval Reserve, and when he came to England, he joined the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, the branch of the Navy made up of civilian volunteers rather than career sailors. When the war came, this professor of chemistry found himself at the Navy's mine school, thrown at the exact problem the Shoeburyness mine had just cracked open. What do you do now that you know how the weapon senses a ship? How do you make a ship the mine cannot sense? Goodeve is the kind of figure this whole story turns on, and he is worth knowing a little better. He was tireless, inventive, and almost completely indifferent to whether an idea was orthodox, as long as it worked. He would go on, later in the war, to lead the department that produced a rack of unlikely weapons, including a device that finally gave escort ships a real chance of killing a submarine before it could dive away, a weapon credited with the destruction of dozens of U-boats. He was the sort of man who could look at a problem the professionals had declared insoluble and treat it simply as a problem that had not yet been solved by the right person. And crucially, the Navy of 1939 and 1940, for all its stiffness and tradition, had found a place to put such a man and had given him room to work. That, as much as anything, is the quiet hinge on which the mine war turned. Goodeve and the scientists around him reasoned it through from the physics. The mine fired because a steel ship distorted the magnetic field in a particular way, concentrating it downward, North Pole pointing down, into the water beneath the hull. Very well, if you could give the ship an opposite magnetism of its own, of just the right strength, you could cancel out that distortion. You could make the ship's total field, as the mine experienced it, blend into the ordinary background field of the Earth. The ship would still be there, but magnetically, to the needle in the mine, it would become part of the empty sea. It would, in effect, become invisible. The way to do it was to wrap the ship in a girdle of heavy electric cable, running around the hull, and pass a carefully calculated current through it. The current created a magnetic field that opposed and cancelled the ship's own. Goodeve gave this process a name that has stuck in the language ever since. He called it degaussing, after the Gauss, the scientific unit used to measure magnetic field strength, which itself was named after the great mathematician Carl Friedrich Gauss. To degauss a ship was to strip away its magnetic signature, and because the current could be adjusted, the same ship could be set up correctly whether it was sailing in the northern hemisphere or the southern, where the Earth's field points the opposite way. Degaussing with fixed coils worked, and it worked well, and the biggest and most valuable ships were fitted with it first. The aircraft carrier Ark Royal was among the early ones. So were the great ocean liners, the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth, now carrying troops instead of tourists. But it was expensive. It took a lot of copper, a lot of skilled labour. and it drew a steady load on a ship's own electrical generators. There was no possible way to fit permanent coils to every merchant ship, every trawler, every coaster, every little vessel that made up the vast, unglamorous traffic on which Britain actually lived. There were simply too many of them, and not enough copper or time in the world. So Goodeve came up with something cheaper, faster, and almost brutal in its simplicity. And it is the part of this story that most deserves to be better known. He reasoned that you did not always need a permanent powered coil humming away around the hull. A great deal of the danger came from that fixed, built-in permanent magnetism the ship had picked up during construction. What if you could simply wipe that away? Drag a heavy cable carrying a strong pulse of current down the outside of the ship's hull, from top to bottom, and the magnetic field from that cable would rearrange the magnetism in the steel and leave the hull with a much reduced signature, a kind of temporary magnetic clean slate that would last for months. He called it wiping. A ship did not have to be rebuilt or permanently wired. It just had to visit a wiping station, be treated in a matter of hours, and sail out far quieter, magnetically, than it had come in. The value of wiping was proved in the most dramatic circumstances imaginable. At Dunkirk, in late spring 1940, when the British Army was trapped on the French coast and every vessel that could float was being thrown into the evacuation, the little ships had to cross waters that the Germans were mining. In a span of about 4 days, British teams wiped 400 ships. They could not have coiled 400 ships in 4 days. They could not have coiled 40. But they could wipe them, fast, and send them across. By the middle of 1940, around 1,000 ships of every kind had been wiped, and the network of wiping stations along the British coast was growing. By the end of that year, well over 1,000 warships and around 2,000 merchant ships had been given some form of magnetic protection. The invisible ship was becoming the normal ship. But protecting your own vessels was only one half of the counterattack. The other half was going on the offensive against the mines themselves, clearing them out of the water so that channels could be reopened. And here too the answer came from the same restless, improvising mines. The old sweep wire was useless against a mine with no cable, so Goodeve and his colleagues built a sweep that attacked the mine the same way a ship did, by magnetism. They took wooden-hulled vessels, wood because a steel sweeper would set off the very mines it was hunting, and had them tow long buoyant cables tipped with electrodes trailing in the sea. By sending powerful pulses of current through the water between the electrodes, they created a travelling magnetic field, a phantom ship, strong enough to reach down and trip the mines from a safe distance ahead of and beside the sweeper. Run 2 such vessels side by side, a couple of 100 yards apart, and they could roll up a wide lane of sea, detonating magnetic mines as they went. This method, and its refinements, stayed in service for the rest of the war. The Royal Navy had learned to fool the mine with a ghost. And then there was the boldest idea of all, which was to hunt the mines from the air. Someone had the notion of taking a bomber, a Vickers Wellington, and fitting it with an enormous ring, an aluminium hoop encased in balsa wood, dozens of feet across, slung beneath and around the aircraft. An onboard generator drove a current through the ring, turning the whole aircraft into a flying electromagnet. Fly it low over a mined stretch of water, and the magnetic field projected downward would set the mines off harmlessly, beneath and behind it. The program was given a deliberately misleading name to hide its purpose. Dressed up as a wireless installation so that no one would guess what the strange ringed aircraft were really for. The first successful detonation of a mine from the air came in early January 1940, near the Kent coast. A few days later, on one sweep, an aircraft dropped a little too low and a mine went off close enough beneath it to hurl the bomber upward through the air. It held together. It flew home. And the ringed Wellingtons went on to clear water, not just in Britain, but, later, over the Suez Canal, keeping that vital artery open far from home. Step back and look at the shape of what had happened, because this is the heart of it. A rigid, professional, superbly engineered German weapon had been answered by a loose, improvising, half-civilian British effort that turned a captured secret into a whole family of countermeasures in a matter of months. Degaussing to hide the great ships, wiping to hide the many, the double cable sweep to clear the channels from the sea, the ringed aircraft to clear them from the air. None of it would have been possible without the mine on the mudflat. But the mine on the mudflat would have been worth very little without the kind of mind that could sit with a diagram of a magnetic needle and ask, calmly, "All right, then how do we make a ship that isn't there?" It is worth pausing on why the answer came so readily from the British side, because it was not an accident. The organisation that grew up around this work, the Department of Unusual Weapons and Unlikely Ideas that the men in it cheerfully described in terms bordering on the lunatic, was built to take a suggestion from anyone and test it fast, without waiting for it to climb a long ladder of rank. One of its officers, a naval reservist who in civilian life was an engineer and a novelist, was Neville Shute, who wrote afterward that the essential quality the work demanded was imagination, the imagination to look ahead and picture what might happen and get in front of it. That willingness to let an outsider into the room, to back a strange idea from a chemistry professor or a novelist or a young reserve lieutenant, was a kind of institutional habit. And against a weapon that depended entirely on secrecy and surprise, that habit was worth more than any battleship. To grasp why all of this mattered so enormously, you have to hold in your mind what Britain actually was in those years. It was an island that could not feed itself. It grew only a fraction of the food its people ate, and it produced almost none of the oil that moved its ships, its aircraft, and its factories. Nearly everything that kept the country alive and fighting came in across the sea, and most of it came in through a handful of great ports and the narrow, crowded coastal channels that fed them. A weapon that could quietly close those channels, one at a time, without ever meeting the Royal Navy in open battle, was aimed not at the fleet, but at the throat of the nation itself. That is what made the magnetic mine, in the last months of 1939, not merely a naval nuisance, but a genuine threat to Britain's survival. And it is what made the afternoon at Shoeburyness one of the most important few hours of the entire war, though almost no one outside a small circle understood that at the time. If your father, your grandfather, or an uncle served in the mine-sweeping trawlers, in the mine disposal teams, at the mine school, or in any of the countless small ships that kept the coastal lanes open in those years, I would be glad to know their name and their ship or unit in the comments. That is one of the truest ways these stories stay alive. Now, at last, we can answer the question the German sailors could not. Why did their mines stop working? Why did a weapon that had been sinking a ship every few days through the autumn of 1939 begin, through 1940, to fail so mysteriously against targets that should have been easy? Ships that a magnetic mine ought to have broken in half were sailing straight over them and living. Fields that should have been lethal were falling quiet. From the German side, looking at their own charts and their own faultless engineering, there was no obvious reason. The mines were being laid correctly. The mechanisms were sound, and yet the results were fading. The answer, of course, was the thing the Germans did not know had happened at Shoeburyness. They did not know that a whole mine had been taken apart on a laboratory bench in Portsmouth within weeks of the crisis beginning. They did not know that the ships passing over their fields had been magnetically hidden, wiped and coiled into near invisibility. They were firing a weapon that depended completely on the enemy's ignorance, at an enemy who was no longer ignorant. The secret had been the weapon. Once the secret was gone, the steel cylinder on the seabed was just a very expensive way of disappointing the men who laid it. And the failure was made worse by choices on the German side that had nothing to do with British cleverness. The German Navy never had enough of these mines to do the job properly. Against the tens of thousands that would have been needed to truly seal Britain's coasts, the actual stocks in the crucial early period ran to only a fraction of that. What they did have was often spread thin, scattered in small numbers across many places, instead of concentrated in one overwhelming, decisive campaign, at the moment when the British had no answer at all. Each new type of mine tended to be rushed into use before there were enough of them to matter, which meant that the British were handed early examples to study and counter before the weapon could ever be used in a mass that might have been fatal. And the rivalry between the Navy and the Air Force, the very friction that had put those mines onto the Shoeburyness mudflats, ran right through the whole effort. A weapon that might, used ruthlessly and in secret and in enormous numbers all at once, have genuinely throttled Britain, was instead dribbled out, contested between services, and, worst of all, handed to the enemy intact at almost the first opportunity. The Germans had built a superb lock and then, through haste and rivalry, given the British a copy of the key. This did not mean the danger was over. It became, instead, a long contest of move and counter-move, the kind of scientific duel Churchill himself called the Battle of the Boffins. And it is important to be honest about that word, defeated, because it does not mean the mines ever stopped being dangerous. It means the British had found ways to reduce a weapon that could have closed their coasts entirely to a weapon that took a steady, survivable toll. That is what victory looked like in this kind of war. Not the enemy weapon vanishing, but the enemy weapon being held at a level the nation could endure while it kept the sea lanes open. When the British defeated the magnetic mine, the Germans reached for a different trigger. They built acoustic mines, which listened for the sound of a ship's engines and propellers instead of sensing its magnetism. The British recovered one, studied it, and within about a month had a noise-making sweep in the water to set them off. So the Germans combined the ideas, building mines that demanded both a magnetic signature and the right sound before they would fire, harder to fool with any single trick. They fitted mines with counters, so that a mine would let a set number of ships pass safely and only fire on, say, the 12th, defeating the sweepers that cleared a channel once and pronounced it safe, and catching a later, unsuspecting victim. They made the magnetic triggers steadily more sensitive as the war went on, chasing the shrinking signatures of degaussed ships. And near the end they developed a mine triggered by the change in water pressure a moving ship creates, a signature almost impossible to fake, which they deliberately held back and did not use in quantity until the Normandy landings, precisely so that it could not be captured and copied before it mattered. That last decision, to hoard the secret rather than spend it, shows that by then the Germans had learned, at terrible cost, the very lesson this whole story teaches. A weapon like this is only as strong as the secret inside it. None of this was won cheaply, and it would be a lie to tell it as a clean triumph. The work of taking mines apart, of clearing them, of sweeping them, was among the deadliest duties of the entire war, and it killed steadily and without ceremony. There was no glory in most of it, and very little public notice. A sweeper crew that cleared a channel of 30 mines got no headline and no medal. They simply went out the next morning and did it again, in the cold, in the fog, in waters they knew might hold a mine set to let the first 11 ships pass and take the 12th. The disposal officers worked alone, or nearly alone, kneeling over a device that had been built specifically to kill the man who tried to open it. It was patient, meticulous, terrifying work, and the men who did it lived with the knowledge that a single wrong turn of a spanner, or a single new trick the enemy had thought of since the last mine, would be the last thing they ever knew. Chief Petty Officer Charles Baldwin, who had knelt in the mud beside Ouvry and helped lift the very first mine's secret into British hands, was dead within weeks. He was killed in early February 1940, along with a group of young reserve officers under training, while dealing with British mines that had broken loose in the Firth of Forth. The man who had survived the most dangerous single hour of the mine war did not survive the ordinary, grinding danger of the work that followed. As the war went on, and German aircraft began scattering parachute mines over land as well as sea, the mine disposal officers faced a new horror. A mine that landed on a town instead of in the water carried a clock fuse that could fire some 20-odd seconds after it came to rest, and that could be restarted by the smallest disturbance, even a footstep nearby. 2 men of the mine school, Lieutenant Commander Richard Ryan and Chief Petty Officer Reginald Ellingworth, made a specialism of these landmines and diffused a great many of them, including, in one stretch of 5 days in September 1940, 6 of the things, among them one that sat threatening an airfield and an explosives works. On September 21st, 1940, at Dagenham in Essex, a mine they were working on detonated and killed them both. They were each awarded the George Cross, the highest award for gallantry away from the presence of the enemy, an honour that had only just been created that autumn precisely because of men like these. That same summer, a mine being examined in a shed at the mine school itself had gone off and killed 5 men in an instant. And behind the named officers and the decorated few stood a vast, mostly anonymous body of men who paid the running cost of keeping the sea lanes open. The fishermen and reservists of the mine-sweeping and patrol service, who took their little ships out into the same cold channels day after day, lost nearly 14,000 men over the course of the war. More than 2,000 of them have no grave but the sea. The merchant sailors who carried the cargoes died in their thousands as well. The captured mine at Shoeburyness saved an incalculable number of lives. It did not make the work safe, it only made it winnable. John Ouvry, the man who knelt first beside the mine, lived. He came through the war and lived on for many years afterward, dying in 1993. Roger Lewis, who took the impression of the sealed ring so that a brass spanner could be made, lived too. But they carried with them always the knowledge of what the work had cost the men who came after them, and of how narrow the margin had been on that mudflat, where a single armed booby trap, a single completed step by a rushed German aircrew, would have ended the whole thing before it began. So what is the verdict, standing back from all of it? It is not that the Germans were poor engineers. They were superb engineers. The mine they built was ingenious, elegant, and very nearly decisive, and the men who laid it and defended the idea of it were skilled professionals doing their duty. The verdict is about something else entirely. It is about the difference between a weapon and a secret, and about which kind of nation is better at keeping the second kind of thing alive. The German magnetic mine was really a secret wearing the disguise of a machine. Its power came almost entirely from the enemy not knowing how it worked, and that kind of power is the most fragile power there is. It can be perfect one week and worthless the next, and the thing that destroys it is not a bigger gun or a thicker armor plate. It is a single specimen in the wrong hands, a single laboratory bench, a single afternoon on a cold mudflat with a set of brass tools. A weapon of steel can be defended, a secret can only be kept, and a secret that has to travel across an enemy's coastline in large numbers, again and again, in a contested operation run by rival services, is a secret that will not be kept for long. The British, for their part, were not simply braver or cleverer. They were fortunate in the particular shape of their own institutions. They were fortunate that when the crisis came, a chemistry professor from the Canadian prairie could be handed the problem and given room to invent a word and a method to go with it. They were fortunate that a department could exist whose whole purpose was to entertain the strange idea, the lunatic suggestion, the outsider's hunch, and to test it in weeks rather than smother it in years. They were fortunate that a novelist in a reserve officer's uniform could sit in on the design of secret weapons because someone valued his imagination more than his lack of rank. And they were fortunate, most of all, in 2 officers and 2 ratings who understood that the way to beat a secret was not to sink more ships or lay more sweeps, but to go out onto the mud while the tide was down and, with steady hands and the right tools, simply take the secret away. There is a lasting mark this story left on the world, and it is worth naming, because it shows how completely the British won this particular round. Degaussing did not end with the war. It became a permanent, standard feature of how warships are built and maintained, to this day, in navies around the world. The word Goodeve, coined in a hurry at a mine school in 1939, is still the ordinary technical term for the thing it describes. Every time a modern warship has its magnetic signature checked and reduced, it is repeating, in refined and peacetime form, the answer a Canadian chemist worked out under the pressure of a losing autumn. The German mine was overtaken and largely forgotten. The British countermeasure outlived the threat it was invented to defeat by the better part of a century. And in the wider war, this early victory bought something priceless. It kept the coastal convoy routes open in the months when Britain had almost no margin to spare. It meant that the great struggle to keep the Atlantic lifeline open, the long fight against the submarines that would run for years, was not lost before it truly began by a quieter weapon closing the ports from underneath. The magnetic mine was one of the first serious technical surprises the enemy sprang on Britain in the war, and the way it was met, captured, understood, and answered in a matter of months set a pattern the country would rely on again and again. Find the secret, hand it to the strange, clever people, let them work fast, and keep the ships moving while they do. The Germans had built a machine of great beauty and had trusted it to stay secret. The British had built something harder to see and harder to copy. They had built a habit of listening to the odd man in the room, And in the winter of 1939, on a stretch of tidal mud at the mouth of the Thames, that habit reached down and quietly unscrewed the future of the war. The men who did it should not be allowed to fade. Lieutenant Commander John Ouvry, who knelt first. Lieutenant Commander Roger Lewis, who watched from a distance so that even failure would teach. Chief Petty Officer Charles Baldwin, who was gone within weeks. Dr. Albert Wood, who read the secret on a laboratory bench. Charles Goodeve, the prairie chemist, who taught a nation how to make its ships disappear. And the thousands of unnamed men of the sweepers and the disposal teams and the merchant crews who kept the sea lanes open and paid for it, ship by ship, name by name. If you want the next chapter of this long, strange story of how a nation at war found the right minds at the right moment, subscribe, because there are more of them. More secrets pulled apart just in time. More outsiders let into the room against all the rules. More ordinary men handed an impossible job who quietly went out and did it. Some of the men in this story have descendants who may be watching right now. If one of them was yours, tell us his name below. That is how the memory survives.